Let's dive into something you might not expect: medieval entertainment. You might imagine that people from the Middle Ages only worked long hours and lived tough lives, filled with plagues and hard labor. But believe it or not, they had some wild and often dangerous ways to have fun. Take a moment and picture this. You're living in medieval times, far from the distractions of today's world. No smartphones, no TV, no internet, but still, people found ways to enjoy themselves. Sure, they worked hard and they faced all sorts of hardships, but when they had a break, they didn't just rest in silence. They had festivals, games, and activities that might shock you today. Now, here's a key question. Did people in the medieval world even have free time? The answer is complicated. For most people, peasants who made up the majority of society, life was all about hard work from dawn to dusk. These people spent long hours in the fields, laboring just to survive. However, they actually had more time off than many of us today. Believe it or not, medieval peasants had between 100 and 150 days off each year. Of course, these weren't vacation days where they could just relax and do what they wanted. Most of these days off were tied to religious holidays. So, once the church services were done and they'd honored the saints, the rest of the day was theirs to enjoy, or maybe to find some trouble. The leisure time they did have wasn't like ours. There wasn't a clear line between work and play. Everything was connected. Your daily life was shaped by the rhythms of the church, the seasons, and the hard work of the land. So, you might think of a medieval day as one long stretch of activities where even breaks could include religious duties. But for the wealthy nobles, leisure took on a different meaning. They didn't toil in the fields like peasants. Instead, their days were filled with activities like hunting, attending grand feasts, and participating in tournaments. But even for them, it wasn't just fun. It was about showing off. It was about power. When a nobleman went hunting, for example, it wasn't just for enjoyment. It was a display of wealth, strength, and leadership. These activities were not only about keeping busy, but also about reinforcing their position at the top of society. Even nobles, however, enjoyed simpler pleasures from time to time. They spent time playing board games, listening to music, and watching performances. But there was still a social aspect to it all. Their fun was often a way to keep up with the norms of court life. As for the church, it had its own complicated view of leisure. On one hand, the church acknowledged that people needed rest and that celebrations were an important part of life. But on the other hand, the church was often suspicious of too much fun. Dancing, drinking, and gambling, that was seen as a dangerous path leading people away from God. And yet, many of the activities medieval people enjoyed were tolerated, at least as long as they didn't cross certain boundaries. Life back then was all about balance, finding ways to have fun without getting into too much trouble. For many, navigating these rules was part of the game. Life in the Middle Ages had a rhythm to it. Winter, for example, was the time when the fields lay fallow and work slowed down. It was the perfect time for people to gather, tell stories, and play games. Meanwhile, the warmer months were busier with farming and harvesting. But even during those busy times, people took breaks. Sundays were always rest days, and there were feast days throughout the year that disrupted the regular work schedule. Then came the harvest season, which was both the most exhausting and the most celebratory time of the year. People worked hard to gather the crops, but once the work was done, they celebrated with a big harvest festival, a time to relax, eat, drink, and give thanks for a good year. Children didn't get the modern concept of free time either. From a young age, they were expected to help out around the house or farm, but they still found time to play. It might not have been with toys like we know them today, but kids created games from whatever they could find: sticks, stones, scraps of cloth. They didn't sit still for long, even though their play often imitated the work of adults, preparing them for the roles they would take on when they grew older. Medieval leisure was mostly a communal experience. People didn't entertain themselves alone. They gathered in taverns, village squares, and even great halls to have fun together. Entertainment, in this sense, was more about the community than about individual enjoyment. People didn't just sit in front of a screen. They were actively engaged in shared experiences, from games to festivals. With limited artificial light, most entertainment happened during the day, with the precious hours of sunlight being the time for fun. When the sun went down, activities were much more limited. People might sit around a fire, tell stories, or sing, but their options were far fewer than we have today. So, yes, medieval people definitely had their share of fun. Their leisure was shaped by their faith, their work, and the seasons, but they found ways to let loose, to laugh, and to enjoy themselves in ways that might seem unimaginable today. In the medieval world, life for the majority of people, the peasants, was shaped by the rhythms of the seasons and the relentless demands of agricultural labor. A typical day for them was a far cry from what most of us understand as leisure. From the first light of dawn, they were up, working the fields, tending to animals, or engaging in some form of back-breaking labor. Their days were long, filled with exhausting tasks that were vital for survival. Despite this, the medieval calendar was surprisingly filled with holidays, feast days, and religious observances, many of which allowed people to take a step back from their hard work, rest, and indulge in social activities. The religious calendar was key in determining when peasants could take time off. Depending on where they lived, the number of holidays could vary, but on average, medieval peasants had anywhere from 100 to 150 days off each year. These were not vacation days, as we think of them now. These days were religious observances. Festivals like Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and Saints' feast days created a rhythm of rest throughout the year. There were prayers to be said, church services to attend, and local rituals to participate in. For most, these days were seen as an obligation. Yet, after fulfilling these duties, the rest of the day was theirs to spend as they wished, and they used it for more than just prayer. Peasants didn't have a clear separation between work and rest. Much of their leisure activities were deeply embedded in the fabric of their everyday life. A harvest festival, for example, wasn't just an event to mark the end of a long season of labor. It was a time for the whole village to come together and celebrate their hard work, a moment of respite before returning to another round of demanding work. These festivals were crucial not only for physical rest, but also for social cohesion. The shared celebration helped reinforce relationships, built communal bonds, and gave people the opportunity to temporarily escape from the pressures of life. The medieval world didn't have what we think of as a traditional weekend. Instead, people worked intensely for certain stretches of time and then had periods of rest that often stretched for days, even weeks. These breaks were built into the calendar by the church, which ruled much of daily life. But even during these breaks, there was still an expectation of social activity, rituals, and sometimes even more work. The rest wasn't purely about relaxation. It was often communal work, like preparing food for festivals or working on community projects, but with far less pressure. For the peasants, every break, no matter how brief, was precious. As soon as the workday ended, which in the summer could be as late as dusk. They took to the streets or the village commons to play, sing, or enjoy food and drink. They would gather in the taverns, the hubs of social life where news was exchanged, games were played, and the rich smells of food and ale filled the air. Taverns weren't just places to drink. They were the center of social interaction. In these spaces, they could relax, share stories, engage in gambling, or listen to music. A well-attended tavern was filled with laughter and conversation, where common people could temporarily forget the hard labor they would return to tomorrow. Even in the roughest of conditions, the tavern was a sanctuary, offering moments of escape. Yet the medieval period wasn't just about feast days and tavern gatherings. There was also the unspoken tension of excess. The church, ever watchful, saw many forms of leisure as dangerous to the soul. Drinking, dancing, gambling, and even sexual activity were often condemned by the religious authorities, though these activities were frequently enjoyed by all walks of life, including the peasant. While the church encouraged prayer and devotion, it also understood the need for rest and play. However, it was always a tightrope walk. Pleasure was seen as something dangerous, something that could lead people away from their faith. So, for the peasants, moments of enjoyment were often paired with guilt and shame, especially in those who strayed too far from acceptable bounds. But in these same moments, medieval people learned to walk the line between pleasure and guilt. People were adept at navigating this tension, finding ways to play and celebrate while staying within the bounds of acceptable behavior, or at least not getting caught crossing them. Life was about balance, and leisure wasn't just about personal enjoyment. It was about the well-being of the community, the sharing of joy, and the communal expression of gratitude for a good harvest or a successful hunting season. In some ways, the festival was a controlled release valve, allowing people to blow off steam in a way that didn't threaten the fragile social structure. Even for the nobility, leisure took on a different meaning. While peasants worked endlessly in the fields, the nobles enjoyed different kinds of leisure activities, though theirs were often about demonstrating power and reinforcing their status. A nobleman's leisure wasn't just about relaxation. It was also about asserting authority and preparing for battle. Hunting was not simply a sport. It was a practice in martial skills. The hunt was also a public display of wealth and status. When a nobleman set out on a hunt, it wasn't just for the thrill of the chase. It was an opportunity to show off the extent of his wealth, the size of his estate, and the skills he had honed. For the aristocracy, leisure activities were a reflection of their position in society. It wasn't enough to simply enjoy a good day. It had to be an opportunity to demonstrate their place in the social hierarchy. Hunting, jousting, and even feasting were rituals that reinforced the nobility's role in society. Nobles participated in tournaments where they demonstrated their prowess on horseback and skill with a lance, all while maintaining the appearance of nobility. These tournaments were not just sports. They were battles in miniature, events where knights honed their skills for actual warfare. Similarly, hunting was not only about the game caught, but also about the spectacle. The hunt itself could last hours or even days, with the nobleman at the center, accompanied by hounds, falcons, and a group of servants. It was a social occasion, a way to bring together allies and reinforce the social order. For the aristocracy, leisure also took place in the comfort of grand banquet halls, where large feasts were held, often lasting for hours or even days. These feasts were as much about politics as they were about enjoyment. A feast wasn't just an opportunity to indulge in rich foods and wine. It was a statement about a nobleman's power and influence. At the table, alliances were formed, enemies were placated, and social status was reaffirmed. Banquets, with their multi-course meals and abundant wine, were elaborate displays meant to reinforce the power of the host and his house. But even among the nobility, moments of personal enjoyment were crucial. While their leisure was intertwined with displays of wealth and power, there were times when they too could let down their guard and indulge in more personal forms of enjoyment. At these times, music, dance, and entertainment provided the nobility with much-needed relaxation, helping them recharge and remain the ruling class. And while these moments were fewer and far between for peasants, they were still significant, valuable interludes in a life that otherwise centered on hard work and survival. In the medieval period, the concept of leisure for peasants was vastly different from that of the aristocracy. While the nobility had the luxury of lavish banquets, jousts, and hunting trips that symbolized their status, peasants had to find ways to enjoy themselves within the constraints of their daily labor. Their lives were marked by seasons of intense work, particularly during planting and harvest times, but these periods of hard labor were often balanced with moments of rest during religious holidays, community festivals, and occasional breaks from the farm. While their work was never truly done, peasants still had significant periods off thanks to the religious calendar, with as many as 100 to 150 days off per year. These breaks were tied to the church's many feast days, saints' days, and religious observances. For the peasant class, holidays meant more than just spiritual reflection. They were times of socializing, eating, drinking, and communal enjoyment. It wasn't so much about rest as it was about coming together as a community after long weeks of working the land. During these holidays, peasants would gather in the village square or the local tavern, where the festive mood was palpable. The beer and ale flowed freely, food was passed around generously, and music filled the air. Games were played, songs were sung, and dancing took place, often in an exuberant way, which might have seemed shocking to outsiders. Despite the more restrained view of leisure held by the church, these moments of celebration were integral to maintaining the social fabric of medieval villages. They were essential for keeping the community tight, knit, ensuring that the labor force was not only connected to each other, but also invested in their shared culture and faith. The peasants' version of fun may not have involved lavish balls or courtly displays, but it had its own unique charm and sense of authenticity. A large part of their communal celebration included storytelling and the recounting of history. Oral traditions were passed down from one generation to the next, whether it was in the form of tales of saints, heroic feats from local legends, or simply amusing anecdotes from the day's work. These stories created a sense of continuity, reminding the villagers of the long-standing bonds of their community, and they served as a reminder of their shared struggles and triumphs. Another source of enjoyment came from simple games. Though peasants did not have access to the fine board games and intricate pastimes that the nobles enjoyed, they were resourceful in creating their own forms of entertainment. They played games that were improvised with whatever materials were on hand: sticks, stones, scraps of cloth, creating their own versions of ball games or running races. These simple activities served both as entertainment and as a way to stay physically active, a necessity for the hard, working peasants who spent much of their time outdoors. Additionally, many medieval peasants participated in religious festivals, which, while rooted in faith, often took on a celebratory tone. Feast days such as Christmas or Easter were not only about religious observance, but also about socializing and enjoying food and drink in abundance. The church itself became a place where communities could gather for special masses and festivities, after which the real fun began. The peasant class, constrained by the everyday demands of life, used these sacred occasions as an opportunity to release pent-up stress, if only for a short while. It's important to recognize that these festivals and breaks were not seen as indulgence, but as a form of spiritual cleansing and renewal. They allowed the peasant to reconnect with their faith and community. The idea that life could be more than just toil was deeply tied to the belief that moments of joy and relaxation, even if brief, were part of a divine order. They believed that taking time to rest and celebrate, as sanctioned by the church, was necessary for spiritual well-being. While peasants were granted more time off than many would assume, this free time wasn't just for leisure. They used these breaks to perform various communal duties that were essential to the village survival. Festivals often included work-related activities like repairing the village's infrastructure, maintaining the church, or preparing for the next agricultural season. In a way, these leisure moments became just as much about fulfilling social obligations as about personal enjoyment. But even so, there was still joy to be found in the togetherness of the community, in sharing food, drink, and stories. While the nobility may have spent their leisure time focused on courtly pursuits, the peasant class made their own form of enjoyment by nurturing their communal bonds. The role of leisure in their lives was a reminder that life was not merely about survival. It was about sustaining relationships and creating moments of joy, no matter how fleeting they might have been. This joy wasn't just about personal pleasure. It was a collective experience that strengthened the ties that bound people together. A shared laugh, a shared drink, a shared story. These were the elements that held the medieval village together. For the wealthy, leisure was often a solitary pursuit designed to display their status to others. But for peasants, leisure was deeply communal. A noble's enjoyment might have been defined by personal wealth or status, but the peasant's joy was defined by the connections they formed with others. It was an intricate dance of work and play, of obligation and escape. For the peasants, moments of rest and relaxation were a much-needed respite, but they were also a reflection of their shared values, faith, and commitment to one another. Despite their many struggles, medieval peasants found joy in their fleeting moments of respite. Their leisure activities weren't born of excess, but out of necessity, to celebrate life, community, and survival. Their moments of freedom were born from the harsh reality of their labor, and in many ways these breaks allowed them to recharge, to laugh, and to find joy in what little they had. By the late Middle Ages, leisure for the common people had evolved beyond mere survival. In a world where the church had a pervasive influence and the cycles of life were often dictated by the agricultural calendar, the peasants' experience of leisure was not just a break from work, it was an essential part of their social and spiritual fabric. The religious holidays, though rooted in faith, were as much about community, celebration, and renewal as they were about worship. This was the time when peasants could step away from the fields, let go of the demands of farming, and embrace moments of connection and joy, not in excess but in shared experience. During these holidays, the village square became a gathering point, a place where people came together to rest, reconnect, and reaffirm their place within the larger community. These festivals were not the grandiose spectacles seen in noble courts, but they had their own significance. Here, food, drink, and simple games provided a break from the daily grind. The laughter of children playing in the streets, the soft hum of music from a fiddler or a group of singers, the warm glow of a bonfire where people gathered to share stories, these moments were essential to the vitality of medieval village life. They were a collective breath, a pause that offered spiritual and social renewal. The communal nature of these gatherings reinforced the deep bonds between people, and in a world defined by hardship and toil, those bonds were a source of immense strength. However, even in the midst of these moments of relaxation, the specter of duty never fully receded. The peasant's leisure was always framed by a sense of responsibility, whether it was the anticipation of the next planting season or the understanding that community survival relied on the collective efforts of all. In a way, this balance between work and rest was what made these moments of leisure so precious. They were not mere escapes from labor, but rather affirmations of the importance of work itself. After all, it was the labor that sustained the village, and it was through that labor that these brief but deeply significant moments of joy were possible. The work and the rest were not two opposing forces. They were interwoven threads that, when balanced, created a stable foundation for the community. Noble leisure, by contrast, was often individualistic. The aristocracy, with its extravagant banquets, jousts, and hunts, lived a life defined by indulgence, competition, and display. Yet even their enjoyment was not free from the burdens of duty. For them, leisure was not simply a break from work, but an extension of their power. Whether it was a hunt in the forest, a grand feast in the hall, or a tournament in the arena, these activities were as much about asserting their dominance as they were about personal enjoyment. Unlike the peasants, whose leisure was rooted in social connection and spiritual renewal, the nobility's leisure was about status, power, and often the pursuit of personal glory. Yet, despite these differences, both the peasantry and the nobility shared one thing in common: their need for rest. The peasants' connection to their land and their community shaped their leisure, whereas the nobility's status and wealth shaped theirs. But both groups understood the value of taking a pause, even if for different reasons. The nobility's leisure provided an opportunity to reinforce their position in society, to enjoy the fruits of their wealth, and to prepare for the demands of governance and warfare. The peasants, on the other hand, used their moments of rest to recharge spiritually, emotionally, and physically, to ensure that they could face the rigors of the next agricultural cycle. This relationship between leisure and duty was also evident in how both classes celebrated religious festivals. For peasants, the festival wasn't just about escaping from work. It was a time to reaffirm their faith, share their bounty with the community, and find joy in collective effort. These breaks were infused with a sense of gratitude and reverence. The meals, games, and dances shared during the festivals were not indulgences but expressions of faith and community. The church may have imposed its religious order on the calendar, but these moments of collective celebration were more than just piety. They were a way of sustaining the very fabric of village life. The nobility, too, celebrated religious holidays, but their participation was often more formal, less connected to the communal spirit of the lower classes. Their feasts and festivities were public displays, an opportunity to demonstrate wealth, power, and influence. While peasants took part in their festivals as an expression of shared joy and labor, the nobility often used religious holidays as an occasion to further assert their dominance, aligning themselves with the divine order and using the festivals to cement their social and political power. For both classes, however, leisure had an important role in maintaining the balance of their world. For the peasants, it was a rare but necessary moment to heal, to bond, and to prepare for the endless cycle of labor. For the nobility, it was a way to assert their place in the social hierarchy and indulge in the pleasures that their status afforded them. Both groups, however different their approaches to leisure, understood the importance of these moments as integral to their survival and success. They recognized that life, even in its hardest moments, needed breaks from the work, moments of respite that were vital to the well-being of both the body and the spirit. In the grand narrative of medieval society, leisure wasn't just a distraction from labor. It was a vital part of the rhythm of life. For the peasants, it was a reflection of the cycles of nature, a time to rest before the next season of hard work. For the nobility, it was a display of wealth, power, and control. Yet both classes shared in the universal human need for rest, relaxation, and renewal. Their leisure, shaped by their respective roles in society, may have looked very different, but it was no less essential for both. And in those moments, both the peasants and the nobility could step away from the endless demands of their work and find a brief sense of respite, be it through communal festivals, personal indulgences, or the simple joy of a moment of peace.